We're just about to open up to the floor, so just think about what sort of questions you might like to ask. We've got a few minutes for questions. But one thing that you brought out, which I think would be a really good idea for us all to discuss, is this element of there's this chasm between what's happening in research and what's happening on the farm. And I think all of the presentations that we've seen here today do illustrate that. And I think what you said about trying to close that gap is so important. So I just wondered, our other speakers, what your thoughts were about how we can do that, how we can get greater collaboration between the scientist and the farmer in order to bring this research onto farm. Where are we going wrong? What are the issues we're getting wrong at the moment, and how can we put those right? Cristobal, I don't know what your thoughts are on this.
So from my point of view, one of the things that we have, the struggle that we have, is that we do genetics. And then we have, in the middle between us and you guys, we have the breeders. And then there's 10 years before something gets to the farm. And then that's a really long time. So that innovation that we have takes. The exciting thing with the gene editing is that all of a sudden now, we could start getting some of those discoveries to the latest recommended list variety that will be recommended next year. We can take it. So we still need a transgenic step, as I mentioned. But NIBE have fantastic facilities to transform many of the recommended varieties. So we could actually take our innovation, put it into 2 or 3 recommended list varieties that will be there next year, and then multiply seed, and then have it in the farm within 3 years. And I think that's the excitement of gene editing, not just a discovery, but then actually when we find something, we don't need to cross it, shuffle all the genes again, and start the whole breeding process again. We can take something that's there, put it in, and then test it. And then perhaps it will work in some varieties, but other varieties will not work, and then we can test that on farm directly. So I think that's something that excites me about gene editing, is that we can now perhaps, it's not circumventing the breeders, we need to work with them, it's part of the toolkit, but we can actually take that step closer to the farmers. And I think that's something that I look forward, but of course we need the policy so that that's not a GM trial. Because if it is a GM trial, then all of a sudden now you have to write applications, which I spent my whole holiday writing for another trial we're doing, because it is GM. So that's a barrier that I see also. Well,
that's interesting. I mean, Brian, Cristobal's just talking there about, some of the wheats that he's got that offer up to a 20% higher 1,000 grain weight that you could have in 3 years' time. What do you think about this area? What can we do to?
I think farmers generally have to collaborate to get a stronger voice, to then go to the breeders and say, this is what we're looking at. And farmers have the ability, if we talk together and work together and have a strong voice, we can direct the ocean liner of the breeders towards what farmers actually want. And I think that sort of gets lost a bit. I think there's a little bit of things where I think farmers really can work together in collaboration and set the tone of where the research should be going. And then hopefully more researchers will come onto farm. And I believe that every single farm should have a scientist on it. There should be a trial on every single farm. There should be an ecologist on every farm, because this is what farming really is changing, and we need to sort of be harnessing this challenge.
Well, that's interesting. There's scientists on every single farm. I'm not sure there are enough scientists. But Brendan, I mean, what do you think, from a scientist's point of view, do scientists want this? Do they want more collaboration with farmers? I mean, does it fit with how you're judged at the moment?
So, firstly, yes, we would like more interactions, and forums like this and others are very useful for that to happen. In terms of how we're assessed research-wise, yes, impact is important, and demonstrating that publicly funded research has an impact for the public is really important. Another point that I'd like to add, leading on from what Cristobal said, very often when we get into these discussions, we realise also that aside from needing some small amount of money to do the work, it's also necessary to bring in other disciplines. And that pulling together of disciplines it can be a real challenge. But I feel if the problem's sufficiently well framed, then pulling, disciplines that wouldn't necessarily be involved in those kinds of questions, attracting their skill set to answer those is a real challenge, but it can happen.
Great. Kate, I mean, you spoke about it quite a lot in your talk. I don't know whether you've got anything else to add to this.
Well, I think also we talk about innovation often relating it to tech. And it's not, I would argue that innovation is not just technology, that if a farmer hasn't done a particular technique or used a particular product before, even if it's been in existence for a while, that's innovative for them. And I would say that that is often what we encounter first, rather than being asked to help support a project where they're looking at the very latest stuff that's out there. And I think that needs to be recognised and understood, and that fed back through research as well, because the research funding structure as it currently exists is very focused on precision agriculture and very what could be seen as much more futuristic and not current problems that a lot of farmers are facing. Brian and I were talking yesterday about how a lot of the funding focuses on very specific solutions, and actually lots of farmers are doing a lot of systems thinking, soil health and otherwise, and actually it's not that easy to access support to do that, so they do end up largely doing it on their own or amongst their peers without any other support. And that seems odd. That seems odd, and that means that pathway that Brian's talking about feeding up isn't happening.
Right. Fantastic. Well, we're going to open it up for questions now. Since this is the World of Innovation session, I'm going to take a question from the app, first of all. We've got two questions here that are quite related. The first one is directed towards Cristobal. So I'm going to take both of these questions together, but I think I'll ask for answers from the whole panel. First of all, Cristobal, how do we rebuild trust between plant science and the public that understandably sees natural as best? And then to the panel as a whole, do you ever actively ask the public or consumers what they want from farmers, so innovation is directly consumer driven? Do you want to answer that first, Cristobal?
Natural. So I think, well, I mean, it's a difficult one because we need education. I think Julie mentioned that yesterday. It's almost like we need a big figure to come out and say we need to think about the science a little bit, because people believe science for climate change, but as Mark Walpert said, they're sensitive about science when it comes to their convictions. But I think we need to put examples out there. So I think with GM, companies were dealing with it. They were focusing on pesticides and so on. But I think there's some really interesting innovations that when you explain them to people, people say, well, I want to get access to that. Having tomatoes that have much higher resveratrol content, as our Dutch colleague was saying yesterday, we can make that. It has to be transgenic, but we can make that. Having oilseed crops that actually make fish oils, that's being done at Rothamsted, to feed fish crops rather than feed fish meal. That's probably much more sustainable, and we know that we need to produce more fish. So I think that we need to have that honest debate, but we need to have it with politicians and start changing the dialogue. I think that the UK public is quite open to science, but we need to explain it to them.
Fantastic. I don't know whether, Brendan, have you got any thoughts on this?
Yeah, similarly, I think, plasmas are natural, but biocides are not. Radioactivity is natural. So our expectations of what we can obtain from natural products, etc., we come across this in the pharma field quite a lot. I think it does require a high-level conversation to be had, management of expectation. But yeah, I mean, I think those conversations have to happen to assure the public, assure farmers, assure scientists that everything's done in the common good, especially around things like GM, for example, but also in the pharma space.
Brian, I know that you do quite a lot in this space. What do you think?
I think that we need to just communicate better as farmers. We need to talk to the general public. They are the main market. They're buying the products. And if we don't listen to them, then it's going to... I think, for me, as I said, every farm should have a scientist. Every farm should be connected with a school, because I think we've missed that connection back to the real grassroots of the next generation. We're always crying out for new entrants, whereas actually, if we can inspire them, every single small nephew, niece, child is given farming at an early age, and the enthusiasm of tractor Ted and all this sort of stuff suddenly gets lost as they go to school. And I think the education programs have to change to really keep this understanding that farming is here to stay, and we are doing great things in the countryside.
Fantastic. Well, look, I'm going to bring this session to a close now. We're running slightly over time. I just wanted to say a huge thank you to my guests in this session. I think that was a tremendously informative and enjoyable talk. I'm sure you'll all agree, and if you'd like to join me in thanking them. Do you want to take a seat back? Thank you.